romantic, that in a word, and I think it's his most romantic piece, from the whole setting and the idea of the signs of the zodiac and the constellations coming to life. That's the quality one needs to bring out of it.
Very nice. Next one, 12.
So my name is Peter Britton, and I'm lucky to have been associated with Sternklang really from its very first performance in 1971 in Berlin. How did I get involved? Well, I was a member of a quartet called Intermodulation, which pioneered live electronic playing in this country, led by two distinguished composers, Roger Smalley and Tim Suster, who both played respectively keyboard and electric viola, plus Robin Thompson on electric bassoon with filter pedals. So we were invited as a group to be one of the 5 quartets required for Sternklang. We rehearsed a bit in Cambridge and then travelled across. And subsequently we played the piece in Munich at the '72 Olympics, followed by a wonderful visit to Iran for the Shiraz Festival. And then a couple of years later there were performances in France and the LP recording. And I was probably 21 or 22, so very raw, but very much absorbed with it. And, you know, it didn't take me a big effort to... I think it was an advantage that I wasn't a trained-up musician. I didn't play sort of Chopin piano concerto or something. So I was able to bring a completely open mind and try and learn these techniques that you need from the beginning. Partly with synthesizer, twiddling a knob, and partly singing with my voice. What do I remember of it? Well, I think we had forgotten that it can get quite cold. And we remembered it after the dress rehearsal that by the time we get to midnight, you need a couple more layers of jumpers on. I remember Stockhausen himself, whether it was after that one or after the performances, being in very mellow mood in the restaurant afterwards and being a great sort of mimic and entertainer. Whereas, you know, when we're rehearsing, okay, he's very serious, he's very understanding as well. I mean, he won't suffer fools gladly, as I say, but he's immensely practical. I mean, I've never met anyone who has, if you think of the 2 hemispheres of the brain, we tend to think one is for imagination and one is for precision. And he had both to the highest degree. I mean, it makes me move just to think of it. So he was able to imagine some crazy ideas, but in putting them into practice, he was so practical. He was the one who was shinning up and down these loudspeaker towers and adjusting the angles and so on. So that's a very vivid memory too. I would say of Sternklang, I suppose of any piece of music, that it's something awaiting perfect performance. One, I don't think you could ever say a piece of music has been done to perfection, but it's particularly elusive in Sternklang because there are so many elements that can be even more clearly done. For example, the 5 chords on which these overtone melodies are based are themselves harmonically related rather than equal tempered related. And so, for example, the chord of F sharp that is used would fall into the cracks of a piano. And yet, with the mix of instruments and voices used, it's very difficult to achieve what with all the other things that the musician has to have in mind, a perfect tuning in that respect. The singers can manage it pretty well, particularly if they're used to Renaissance singing, where you would tend to go for pure tuning rather than equal tempered. That's one aspect. Another aspect is the tempi, which is set as a whole series of different tempi, each for one model. But those are themselves related harmonically, so that the slowest pulse that underlines a group of models, when you have 2 beats to that makes a particular pulse, and then 3 beats to that. So in theory, if the two models are going simultaneously, their downbeats will occur together. Again, that's something the players, singers can have in mind, but it's difficult to always achieve, because the players, as well as doing straight through the models, often have to improvise a transformation, which is very poetic image, like a chrysalis of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly eventually. So you maybe start off by you're doing the dolphin model, Delphinus, and you have to transform it into Cetus, the whale, which gives, you can imagine the picturesque element of that, and you try and achieve it musically by step changing one model into the other. So that also conspires against everything being exactly right. But I think the piece allows for that. I think the composer allows for that. He's created a world which is organic, and which, like our world, is never perfect, but you're always aspiring to that. And the nice thing for the audience is that they create their own sound balance of the piece. Typically, and I think it would be the same for me if I'm in the audience, you start off the evening by visiting each group in turn, like at a sort of cattle show, and getting a taste of each one. And then you tend to settle towards the middle to get an idea of how they sound. And of course, one of the poetic things I haven't mentioned yet is the sort of singing telegrams that happen. So a sound runner, as he calls them, takes one of these models from one group to another, and so you begin to hear, in some cases, it infects the whole park, and you gradually hear the same theme which was in group one fill out the whole park, and that's a wonderful moment. The difference in doing it in the park in Iran compared to Munich, or for example, was that it was almost heaving with solid crowds, and for the sound runners to go through, the torchbearer was more like a policeman, sort of clear the way, because although it was the Shah's ill-gotten gains that were paying for this festival, I don't know how many million Deutschmark, they at least had the good sense to make a number of the concerts free to the public, and a lot of people came along out of curiosity. I remember attending the performance of Mantra, which was in one of these wonderful Turkish courtyards where you have the flat lake in the middle, on which they built the stage with 2 grand pianos, and the 2 Kontalski brothers who were playing it at that time. And the audience would begin to applaud during the piece as though at a boxing match, when they sensed that one pianist was sort of outdoing the other. And Stockhausen really enjoyed that as well, that it was a different kind of reaction, rather than the sort of po face sitting there and grinning and bearing it. Lovely sound quality there also, because he had, in these Persian towns, the way to get across town is jump across rooftops, because they're all so close together. And he'd had his loudspeakers mounted right up on the rooftops, which made a really gorgeous sound inside the courtyard.
Can we start from the end?
I was always keen to try and do the piece in England, and I wanted to do it in a lovely park in Cambridge, but it was never quite possible to get the resources together. But in 1988 came the opportunity for the Huddersfield Festival to put on a Stockhausen week or fortnight, and the director of that, Richard Steinitz, invited us to do Sternklang. It was in November, so it was an indoor performance, and there was a precedent for that from I think around 1980, we were due to do it in Bonn, in the big National Garden Festival. And that year the Rhine flooded. There was so much rain that everything was inundated. So Stockhausen said, okay, we go and build a park in the Beethovenhalle. He ordered sort of 50 trees from a florist and various bushes. And therefore, he made the piece possible to perform indoors, but it's all a bit a bit of a compromise, that you don't get the romanticism of a summer evening in the park, which is the unique thing about Sternklang. Whether or not one accepts his suggestion that this is for beings from other planets to prepare them or to prepare us to meet them, that we can take that or leave it. But what I do respect in that aspect is that he had the imagination to look beyond the purely terrestrial circumstance that we find ourselves in. It's a sort of philosophical position rather than a kind of away with the fairies that we tend to think, was he mad? No, he was just, as any speculating mind would do, thinking beyond the earthly.